Well, welcome to Beat Diabetes. We're going to continue to look at this book, The Diabetes Diet by Richard K. Bernstein, Dr. Richard Bernstein. He wasn't always a doctor in his adult life. He started out with a career as an engineer. And then he found out a way to normalize his blood sugar as we've been studying. And he got so excited, he wanted everybody to know it, but nobody could accept it. And so he said, fine, if you can't beat him, join him. I'll become a doctor. Maybe then they'll listen. Some have listened. Others still ignore him altogether or reject him as a kook. I like him a lot, if you can't tell. And if you've been watching this Beat Diabetes channel for very long, you know that I do. All right, well, let's get on to some of the quotes from this book. He talks about another guy that many of you know named Gary Taubes. It's kind of interesting how a lot of these low-carb guys know each other or know of each other. And he mentions Gary Taubes' articles, kind of like breakthrough articles that really opened the eyes of some to the fact that saturated fat is not the boogeyman, is not the evil monster and villain that everybody assumed it was. And when you understand that, it frees you to eat more fatty and protein foods, and you don't have to worry about it so much, and you can cut your carbs way down. So he talks about an article called The Soft Science of Dietary Fat that came out in 2001. That was in what? Science, a journal called just Science. And then he also talks about another article in 2002 in the New York Times Magazine called What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie? What if it's been a big fat lie? Talking about, again, saturated fat. And what Dr. Bernstein says is, there never were and still never have been any studies supporting the notion that dietary fat is the killer it was for decades claimed to be. Not only is it not a killer, it's actually good for you if you eat it in the context of a low-carb diet. Now, I'll never forget what I read in one book that he repeated it, I think, a couple of times, trying to think of who it was. I can't think of his name right now, but basically he said, fat is not a problem as long as you don't eat high carb, but if you eat high carb, all bets are off. So probably the most dangerous diet you can eat is a high carb and high fat diet. And that's pretty much what Americans do. They just eat high carb, high fat, and while they're at it, maybe some high protein as well. Anyway, Dr. Bernstein has come to some conclusions that are being accepted more and more these days. But listen to this quote. He says, quite a number of experts maintained that the so-called complex carbohydrates such as whole grain breads, oats, and pasta were the answer to nearly every dietary need. But he goes on to say what was happening then, Americans getting fatter, the incidence of diabetes increasing dramatically, kept happening, and it is still happening today. So you're going to have to eat something. There's only 3 macronutrients, and one is fat, and one is protein, and one is carbohydrate. And if you cut down on any one of those categories, you'll bump up in the other categories because you got to eat something, and you will eat something. So if you say, I don't want any protein, you'll eat more carbs and maybe more fats. If you say, I won't eat fat. I think fat is an evil, evil thing. You'll eat more carbs. If you cut down the carbs, you'll eat more fat. And the thing that keeps a lot of people from cutting the carbs, you can prove. I mean, I can prove, you can prove, your mama can prove that when you cut down the carbs, your glucose goes down. Fasting glucose will go down. Your A1C will go down. Your average glucose levels throughout the day will go down. You cut the carbs, that'll happen. No controversy, no dispute, no argument. It will happen. But some people say, yeah, but if I do that, I'll end up eating more fat and then I'll get a heart attack and die. So what have I really gained? And as long as you fear fat, you'll never be able to jump in with both feet into a low-carb diet because there's almost no way you can eat low carb and not eat more fat. You just will. So Dr. Bernstein is of the same mind as me and Dr. Jason Fung and Dr. Ben Bickman and Eric Westman, all these guys, and there are more coming up every day, and more coming up on YouTube, more writing books, promoting a low-carb diet for metabolic health. And Bernstein is like the original. Before there was a Dr. Jason Fung, before there was a Dr. Eric Westman, before Dennis Pollock knew anything at all, Dr. Bernstein was promoting and living a low-carb diet. So he says when Gary Taubes wrote these articles in the early 2000s, he said, it didn't convince me. I was already a believer from like 20 years before, but it vindicated me. He felt good about it. He's like, okay, finally we got somebody. And of course, Dr. Atkins was also on board well before then. I think Dr. Atkins was on board with low carb in the late 1970s, if I'm not mistaken. All right, well, let's look at another quote. The reason that a low-carb diet can help you become or remain slim is rightly linked to the hormone insulin, which is the principal fat-building hormone. As blood sugars decrease, the efficiency of insulin increases, further minimizing insulin levels in your body. One of the things that people sometimes slam Dr. Bernstein for, or at least they don't seem to respect him so much, is because he does focus a lot upon getting your glucose normalized. And he's so fanatical about getting your glucose normalized because that's the way he fixed himself. And he's like, well, that's what we all have to do. And I agree completely. But one of the things that some people don't like him for is the fact that they say, well, we now know better than to even worry about glucose. Glucose, schmucose, doesn't matter. The main thing is insulin. If you just keep the insulin low, then you got no worries and you don't have to think about glucose. You don't have to talk about glucose. You don't have to write about glucose. You don't have to sing about glucose. Just worry about the insulin, baby. The insulin, that's where it's at. What people fail to understand is the incredibly tight link there is between high glucose and insulin surges. For the type 2 diabetic is what I'm talking about, but it actually works out the same thing for the type 1. But let's talk about the type 2. If you're a type 2 and you still have a working pancreas, and most type 2s do have a working pancreas, when your glucose goes high, guess what? There's a signal from the body to the pancreas. Produce insulin, please. Produce insulin. The pancreas says, I've already been doing that. And he's huffing and puffing and trying to produce insulin. It's like, no, you got to produce more and still more and still more and still more. So there's a link. If your glucose goes high, your pancreas is going to definitely try putting out every little drop of insulin it can put out in order to try to deal with that high glucose. So if you lower the glucose, my friend, guess what? You're not going to have to deal with so much insulin. So some of you almost feel arrogant about the fact that, well, in the old days, everybody worried about glucose, but me, I'm smarter now. I know better. Forget the glucose. It's just the insulin. Well, no, it's both. High glucose will always produce high insulin until your pancreas wears out and huffs and puffs itself to death. And then you're going to be injecting insulin. And that's the problem for a lot of type 1s. They're still eating high carb because their thinking is, well, I can take insulin to cover it, but they end up taking way more insulin than is natural or normal, and they have all kinds of health problems themselves. So you can't just say, well, I'll just give myself more insulin. If I want to eat a couple of donuts tonight, I'll give myself more insulin. If I want to eat bread and a baked potato and drink a big supersized Coke, I'll just give myself more insulin. Yeah, you can do that. But number one, you'll never be precise. You'll probably go way too high and then you'll drop way too low. But secondly, it is unhealthy to have to give yourself that much insulin. Your body was made to deal with carbohydrates by giving small little squirts of insulin and bring everything down to normal in a nice, gentle, soft manner. But when you're jerking up and falling down and jerking up and falling down and your pancreas is puffing and huffing, pouring out insulin, or you're injecting more and more insulin, it's very, very unhealthy. So do not feel that insulin is the only thing to talk about. If you bring your glucose levels down through diet, not through injecting more and more insulin, but if you bring down your glucose through diet, your insulin levels will fall. If you're type 2, your pancreas won't have to put out much insulin. And guess what? You will become more insulin sensitive than you have been in a long time. And if you're a type 1, you just won't have to take so much insulin. So either way, you'll end up with less insulin. So don't suppose that Dr. Bernstein knows nothing about insulin or the fact that it's very unhealthy. It's essentially poisoning your body along with the high glucose. I've heard Dr. Jason Fung refer to glucose toxicity. Toxicity comes from the word toxic, and it means poison. So glucose poisoning, that's what you're doing when you've got high glucose, or insulin toxicity, you're being poisoned by high levels of insulin. But the answer is the same, a low-carb diet. And your pancreas just doesn't have so much to do. It can work and do some work. It's not that your pancreas is to be so pitied that you don't give it a single carb ever. That's not necessary, and I don't think it's even healthy. But you can't overwhelm it. It's like the difference between a brisk 20-minute walk versus a forced 20-mile march in just a few hours in the cold of winter. You're abusing your body with that 20-mile march in the freezing cold. But to take a 20-minute walk on a nice sunny spring day, that's good for you. It's healthy for you. And so it is with your pancreas. To give your pancreas a little work to do and to eat a few carbs here and there, perfectly healthy, perfectly natural. But to overwhelm your pancreas day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, unhealthy, unnatural, and it's poisoning your body. You don't need high insulin. You don't need high glucose. And somehow they're linked together, and it all relates to the amount of carbs you eat. We call it a low-carb diet. You know what? I think it's really a norm-carb diet. It's eating the normal way, the way people used to eat a couple of 100 years ago, before we learned about things like sugar and Little Debbie snacks and fruit juice and Coca-Colas and donuts. A couple of 100 years ago, we just ate normal. And you could get by with eating a potato here and there, or eating a little bread, or pulling an apple off of a tree, because you ate normal, and you typically in those days you were slim. Today we're not slim. We do not eat normal. We eat way too many carbs, and we are paying the price for it. But when you reverse and go back to eating a norm carb diet, things will begin to reverse in your metabolic syndrome, and you'll begin to get your metabolic health back. And that, my friend, is good news. In addition to Beat Diabetes, Benedict and I do have another YouTube channel and another type of ministry. I'm referring to our Bible teaching channel, which goes by my name, Dennis Pollock. While you can only see Benedicta with me on Beat Diabetes occasionally, you can see us study the Bible together at our dining room table every Thursday. With all that we're doing, producing hundreds of videos and podcasts, sponsoring African missions, helping diabetics reverse their diabetes, giving food to African widows, and sponsoring free medical clinics in Nigeria and Kenya, we need your help. Please consider making regular contributions to Spirit of Grace Ministries.